Bonjour. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the last plenary session of this International Roundtable. So, for those of you who do not know me, my name is Joëlle Vitiello, and I teach in the Department of French and Francophone Studies, and my pronouns are she, her, hers in English. Welcome to students, staff, faculty members of the community, and parents visiting for Family Fest today. So the last plenary session convenes our 4 plenary speakers, and I am going to introduce each of them. In case you haven't been able to attend their sessions, you will know who they are. So the first one I'm going to introduce is Melanie Yazzie, a member of the Navajo Nation. She's Assistant Professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota and co-author of the book Red Nation Rising, From Border Town Violence to Native Liberation, and another book, The Red Deal, Indigenous Action to Save the Earth, both of which came out in 2021. She's also the co-host of the podcast Red Power Hour, and she's the lead editor for the open access journal called Decolonization. And she organizes with the Red Nation, a grassroots native-run organization committed to the liberation of indigenous people from colonialism and capitalism. So you can come up so people will recognize you. Awesome. Next we have Marisa Ruiz-Trejo, a feminist anthropologist, writer, journalist, and activist from Chiapas, Mexico, and professor at the Universidad Autónoma de Chiapas. Her recent publications include Feminist Anthropologies in Mexico, Epistemologies, Ethics, Practices, and Diverse Views, and Decolonize and Depatriarchalize the Social Sciences, Memory, and Life in Chiapas, Central America, and the Caribbean, which came out in 2020. She's also the author of Mekabodi Pawe Uwak Ulu Ubiam America Latina, and I don't know if I pronounced that right. That came out in 2021. So, thank you. Next, we have filmmaker Adam Khalil, a member of the Ojibwe tribe. He's a filmmaker and artist from Sault Ste. Marie in Michigan, and I pronounced it French way, sorry, whose practice attempts to subvert traditional forms of image making through humor, relation, and transgression. He is a co-contributor to New Red Order and a co-founder of Cousins Collective. Khalil's work has been exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art, Sundance Film Festival, the Walker Art Center, the Lincoln Center, Tate Modern, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit, the Toronto Biennale in 2019, and the Whitney Biennale 2019 also, among other institutions. Khalil is the recipient of various prestigious fellowships and grants, including but not limited to a 2021 Creative Capital Award, 2021 Herb Alpert Award, Sundance Art of Nonfiction, a Jerome Artist Fellowship, CineReach, and the Gates Millennium Scholarship. And we are making his films that were shown on Wednesday available to the public. Yeah, you'll have a link. And finally, Carol Boyce Davis, who is the H.T. Rhodes Professor of Human Letters and Professor of Africana Studies and Literatures in English at Cornell University. And the name of the department is really significant, as she explained to us this morning. She is the author of a prize-winning Left of Karl Marx, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones, published in 2008, Black Women Writing and Identity, Migrations of a Subject, published in 1994, Caribbean Spaces, Escape Route from Twilight Zones, from 2013, and a bilingual children's story, Walking / En Avant, from 2016-2017 in English and Haitian Creole. She has also published so many articles and chapters, over 100, but she's also published 13 critical editions on African diaspora, and Caribbean literature and culture, and many popular essays and reviews that have appeared in The Guardian in London, The Washington Post, and other media outlets. Her forthcoming book is titled Black Women's Rights, Leadership and the Circularities of Power, published by Rowman and Littlefield, Lexington Books in 2022, coming out tomorrow? Okay. So let's... So the way this roundtable goes is that we're going to enter a conversation. I'm going to ask a few questions to the four speakers. We have a couple of mics, so I'll need one to start. And I anticipate absolutely no trouble having a conversation with our four plenary speakers, and then we'll come back for an open Q&A. So, do I sit here? Can someone give me a mic? Oh, here. And can we get a picture? Okay. Where's the picture?
Documenting.
And how do I turn this on? Hello, can you hear me? Awesome. So I have prepared many questions, but we can totally, digress, and we'll follow your conversation. So my first question for you is how you perceive the work of decolonization in its multiple variations, multiple audiences and modes, and what does it mean to do this work of decolonization? Who needs to do it, and what are its limitations? So that's enough for the next 3 hours. All right. Okay, everyone has a pen. And okay, my first question for you all is how you perceive the work of decolonization in its multiple variations, audiences, and modes, and what does it mean to do a work of decolonization? Who needs to do it? And also, what are its limitations? And I'm thinking of the title of a roundtable, the impossibilities of decolonizing knowledge and power. If you need a microphone, just tell me.
Is it on? On? Yeah. Okay. Well, it's work, right? Okay, it's work. That's the first thing we have to say. And it's both mental and physical labor in a way because it's intensive. And I say intensive because it's not, it's stressful work because it's like really trying to unpack all this difficult history and trying to find ways to not make the same mistakes again. And I think that's what I was saying earlier, that many of the countries that got independence, they were still just trying to hold on to the fact that they had a flag and they had people trying to put in power, but then did not have enough energy to move things even further. I found, ironically, the places that actually had a real revolution, where they took power, actually did some of that work. I went to Angola, for example, for a UNESCO meeting. We were working on the General History of Africa, a special volume on the African diaspora. And we had meetings in different places. One was in Angola. And what the Angolans had done was all the big statues of people like the Las Casas and all of them, they had put them in a courtyard in their museum of, their military museum. And that was one of the first things they did. They found a way to take down those statues and put them in a place where you could still see them, but they weren't having the same kind of power they had like in the middle of the city or downtown or what have you. So this is what I mean about, it's like ongoing work, and for those of us who are doing intellectual work is also work, it's a labor. It's not to be compared to people doing physical labor in a non-stop kind of way, the 9 to 5, as the hairdressers who stand on their feet all day and so on. But it's still work, and if we see it like that, then we can see how we are donating our own energies to a certain set of liberatory practices. Limitations are many, but my point is that it has to be continuous. That's the first point I want to say. It's because many people, that easy victory, and then you stop and you celebrate, and then you realize you really haven't really gone that far. So it's continuous, and that's what really takes our energy and depletes time and so on. And I think that's the first thing I'll say. I'll let my colleagues continue.
Trick question. I think one thing I've been thinking about a lot recently, especially with like Native or Indigenous representation and liberation movements, is the idea of temporality and the position of being kind of stuck in the past to be authentic, and that also decolonization has a connotation of going back to something, and how maybe that's not really the way to go. Yeah, refashioning futures, and then also this idea of the semi-colony was really helpful to kind of to rethink through this stuff, because I think one of the biggest issues with understanding decolonization or what it is or how it can be done is also acknowledging that the colonial project's still ongoing. Maybe just thinking about stuff like land acknowledgement, which was talked about a little bit, just thinking how absurd the idea is to have this kind of magical incantation or recitation at the beginning of an event, as if it could magically do something, and the kind of like primitive magical thinking that's kind of coming out of. So maybe I'll just leave it at that for now. At its finest.
The land acknowledgement. Hello? Hello, can you hear me? Test. Oh, this one's way better. For some reason, that one was low. Yeah, like land acknowledgement is the epitome of savage philosophy. Try not to be pessimistic, because, Dr. Boyce Davies talked about, and I think a lot about Vijay Prashad, right, who leads up the Tricontinental, that the work of culture, what is it like Fidel Castro talked about? We must engage in the war of ideas as an important site of struggle. And oftentimes, I think in movements that might fashion themselves or be called decolonial or movements for decolonization, there's like a hierarchy of wokeness or like direct action or, revolutionary struggle that might seem, violent or like a flash of some sort, that's like the pinnacle of what decolonization might look like or manifest as. But that actually what we do, in the academy, or really, Adam's not in the academy, but when we're engaged in representation and the labor of representation, which all of us, I would say, do that, right? Discourse about decolonization or that might be deemed decolonial, that we're engaged in a war of ideas. And I struggle myself being cited in a university, some days I just want to give up and walk away. And other days, like today, after listening to Dr. Boyce Davies, I'm like, you know what, this is worth the struggle. Because what we do in these institutions is we struggle. Even though we don't often think about this, there's a reason why like critical race theory is this thing, the thing that the right is talking about. There's an assault on ideas. And we're in a moment where there's a reckoning that's happening in the realm of culture, at least in the United States, I would say in like a post-2020 moment. And so there's something of a cultural revolution happening. Mao talked about this too, right? The notion of a cultural revolution. And so if we're talking about where does decolonization happen and like who does decolonial work, I go back and forth with whether or not I'm convinced that the work that I do in the academy is even remotely decolonial. And I think sometimes academic institutions should be abandoned completely, actually, some of them. But that education and the realm of ideas, what we do is culture work here, right? When we educate and when we write and when we engage in the labor of representation as a community, right? As a commons. And so that is a struggle. and we must engage in the war of ideas. And not just as sort of this like moral kind of code of what it means to do the work of decolonization, but to read this historical moment as a moment in which the work of culture is actually like important for, you know, getting us maybe a little bit past the semicolon, right? And continuing the hard work of decolonization. Sometimes decolonization looks like burning down a police station. And sometimes decolonization looks like something else, right? It looks like the work of culture. Looks like toppling a monument. Toppling a monument is culture work. That's the realm of culture, if ever there was one. Popular culture, the renaming of a football team, right, that has native racist mascots, right, that represent that, because football is the ultimate American pastime, if you want to talk about culture. And so that work, even though it is often deemed, I think, by people in the movement as lesser work than kind of like the hard-hitting, kind of like frontline direct action stuff, because sometimes there is this like hierarchy of what we think constitutes real decolonial or revolutionary struggle and work. That's what's happening right now. And it is actually changing things in a very messy, incomplete way. But I think it is continuing, and your framework, Dr. Boyce Davies, really helps to think through how that work continues. And that where we are historically right now, those of us, you know, who, for me as an indigenous person, begrudgingly have to belong to the United States, that is where we're at right now. And it's important work to continue to contribute to and to struggle with. And we can do that in academic institutions. However perilous that work might be, like, I think it's important. So those are just thoughts. But that's not the only type of decolonization, right? There's so much. There's such a rich history of actual decolonization in the form of revolutionary struggle or national liberation, healing, right, from trauma. The notions of decolonization that have come out of the legacy of boarding and residential schools with indigenous people cited in North America that are about justice. The question of justice is always at the center, right? Justice or repair when it comes to decolonization, which I haven't talked much about, but my wide-ranging thoughts on this, but this is just kind of, you know, my own reading of where we're currently at, and as you say, trying to find language to describe that, and thinking about it in the register of decolonization.
Can I just listen? I think that I have a lot of things to learn, and I am very happy to be here because I need to open my ears, and I think that for the first question, I don't have like a recipe for talking about decolonization of knowledge, but I can talk about my own experience in my university in Chiapas, in the south of Mexico. And if you ask how can we do for decolonization of knowledge in my university, I think that first of all, I cannot think about decoloniality without thinking about depatriarchalization. And also, I think that it is very important to think about transdisciplinarity. That's something very important because we continue thinking about disciplines, and I am not a disciplinary person. I think that we need to do things like that, talking not just with people at the universities, but also with people in social organizations and other artistic and literary spaces. And also, I think that intersectionality is something that we need for decolonizing knowledge, and also intertextual collaborations. I think that we need to cite not just academic canon texts, but as we saw in this roundtable, poetry is very important, literary essays, performance, and as a lot of indigenous and Afro descendant anthropologists are doing in Mexico, they are mixing and they are doing this intertextual collaboration and intertextual collaboration and inter-knowledge. And also I think that it is important to make circulate knowledge in another way, to break with those ideas that allow just knowledge in the universities. And with the second question that you did, and I know because you gave me a paper about the work of solidarity in international. Did you? We will talk about that. Okay, thank you.
Does anyone want to add to what you have each said?
Hello, there we go. You made me think, you know, because to position myself, I often tell folks that I'm a historian of social and political movements, but I'm also a social and a historical actor within those movements. And being cited in whatever a movement might be or look like, you know, an organization like the Red Nation that participates and helps to, you know, formulate those movements and what they look like, I often find academic renderings, so like people have studied the Red Nation, for example, academics have studied the Red Nation, and you know, bless their hearts, but they get a lot wrong. And the reason they get a lot wrong is because they don't participate in the movements, and they see us as a research site that they can then extrapolate theory or analysis from. And this is something that constitutes research, I think, in a very conventional academic sense. And something that I tell a lot of the young people who I frienter in the Red Nation is that we're not research subjects, we produce knowledge, right? These movements are sites of rich theoretical and historical knowledge production. And that would seem kind of like a no duh kind of argument, but it's actually very difficult to assert that in terms of who we think produces knowledge and like where theory comes from, and that instead of treating people like subjects of our research, treating them as people who produce the knowledge, you know, it's gonna save the world, or, you know, or even it doesn't have to save the world, but it's something that contributes, right, to a different kind of canon. I don't know if we should use the word canon, but I think a lot about the canon and the question of who we think of as somebody who produces knowledge, as an intellectual, where they're cited, and then how we challenge that when we produce knowledge, especially those of us who are trained in the guild, right? Those of us who have PhDs who've been trained in academic institutions, how we challenge that, or then how sometimes we unconsciously reproduce that, and then how do we change those behaviors and patterns? But your comment made me think about that in terms of how do we go about decolonizing knowledge production?
Well, maybe kind of riffing on that and also thinking about the kind of legacy within anthropology of knowledge extraction, and then kind of thinking about the difference in quality between information and knowledge, where it's like something like information should be accessible to all and freely available, but knowledge has a different kind of quality or patina to it, where it feels, to me anyways, like it has to be earned or gifted, or has like a different exchange value. But also because like, as we're trying to like define what decolonization is, it's reminded me, and how we were talking about culture in relation to that. There's this awesome text by Alexander Troki about the invisible insurrection, and it ends with like, to define one's purpose limits one's potential. So also kind of maybe apprehension around trying to define it, or giving it space to be able to exist in ways we can't even formulate or imagine yet. Or like, what's the political imaginary horizon line that we're all working towards? Yeah.
Okay. I'm like you too. I'm like, can I listen and learn? Yeah, because for me, it's really significant to be able to be on a panel with three people who are coming from that indigenous experience. I say this because in spite of the fact of being a Caribbean woman of African origin, African diasporan identity, a lot of our relationships to the landscape, to the environment, to the places we come from, were unwillingly, right? Because of dispossession of indigenous peoples. In the Caribbean, that's what it was. So how can black people then, African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, then just accept a sense of an identity that erases people as well? So to me, it has to be a discussion that learns from and supports and is in solidarity with indigenous communities across the Americas. And I like to stress the across the Americas bit because North America, where we are right now, positions itself as the only America. And when people in the Caribbean say you're going to America, they're talking about coming to the United States. So that sort of dominant imperial framing of America as only North America is problematic. And I was doing a Fulbright in Brazil once, and there was a big sign for a conference on Afro-American studies or something. And I was really excited to go because I was thinking, wow, there's going to be a lot of people from the US I'm going to see and talk to because I thought that's what it was. And when I went there, it was people from all of the other Americas that don't get recognized. So even we who participate in some of these fields operate from an assumption of a certain kind of US-centric identity which eliminates the other Americas, even if we're coming from them, which is an amazing thing how language works in this context. So keep it in mind across the entire Americas is really the scheme of relationships. And you can see all of the patterns, the erasures, the statuaries, the language, the imposed languages, the blanqueamiento, the whitening that people go through is all across. US has it too. I tell my students what Michael Jackson did fits completely perfectly with any Brazilian or Latin American discussion of whitening. You know, that whole question of trying to find a way to erase your initial appearance or moving into other families so that you can, lighten the entire family and so on. So all of the Americas are products of this sort of new formation that came in via colonialism and therefore still operate with the same logics, just in different forms, different languages, different appearances, but it's going on. And erasing the indigenous people was the fundamental bottom of how that happened. Because if you follow what Las Casas did, he said, well, it's so difficult for the indigenous people to work, let's bring in Africans. So then you lay another set of oppressive practices on top of one horrible one already. And then you bring people from India. Like, oh, black people don't want to be slaves anymore. Let's bring Indians and have them work the sugarcane plantations. That's what they did, creating more and more layers of oppression, one on top of the other, so that in the end, using Jamaica Kincaid's language from a small place, she realized suddenly that her presence on the island was the result of a very foul, horrible deed. How do you unpack all of that? And are you complicit with that, or are you going to really push back against it? I think that's the question, and there's no in between. You're either doing one or the other, really.
Do you want to say something? Can I add one more thing to that? Hey. This might lead into the international solidarity question, or it doesn't have to. The same can be said for like indigenous struggles in Turtle Island, like the US and Canada specifically. We can be remarkably provincial and exceptionalist in indigenous studies, but also in our communities about how we conceive of decolonization. Who is it for? What does it mean? And I myself have learned a great deal about how to have a much more expansive relationship with this, what used to be really, in my perspective, a quite small understanding of what decolonization is, because I grew up in the United States and I've moved in these spaces, and I belong to these spaces most of my life. And so, even just realizing that the term decolonization, can pertain to other contexts outside of like our nations, for example, in the United States and Canada, it would seem again like of course this history exists, but actually recuperating that history and the history of deep international solidarity that has existed between indigenous liberation struggles in Turtle Island and like revolutionary struggles in places like Palestine, for example, or Northern Ireland, that are deemed themselves decolonial, right? And they're talking about a particular type of decolonization in their locality, but that those relationships and those routes have always existed. And so the way we talk about decolonization today, you know, in our communities as indigenous people here, just reminding ourselves not to be like small, right? To think small. Even though decolonization happens on lots of different scales, it can happen in small ways and can happen in massive ways, like a mass movement. But I think sometimes the larger scales get lost, I think, actually in how we conceive of decolonization within, you know, indigenous organizations or even in indigenous studies. This happens a lot in the Southwest, where I come from as a Navajo person. And so as indigenous people, we also have a lot to learn, I think, from these other histories and these other struggles of decolonization. And that's another, I guess, axis of solidarity that is very important for me and has informed my own political development and my intellectual growth around the question of decolonization. Oh.
Just kind of riffing off that, I think something we've been struggling with the NRO is also thinking about maybe the somewhat inherent conservatism of a lot of indigenous liberation movements. Idea of even like red suprematism or like banishing around the phrase settler colonist willy-nilly, because obviously that phrase doesn't apply to many people who've come to this place for many different historical reasons, you know, and how that language can flatten that possibility of solidarity across that. And then also thinking how you were talking about the Caribbean being this place where everything is so nuanced and multi-layered and complicated that it's not as cut and dry as maybe it would be nice for it to be. You know what I mean? And I lost my train of thought, but.
There's so much to learn from the Caribbean, indigenous struggles in the US and Canada. We need to engage more.
To follow up on this, okay, it's working. So, so how do you see the work of decolonization of knowledge and power and the work of solidarity that you have started to address, but in an international way? And I'm thinking, you know, how do you build solidarity with other indigenous communities? And I'm thinking of Maori communities, I'm thinking of Innu communities, Polynesian communities. How do you build that, or is it something that you're working on? And throughout each of your talks, I mean, you have made connections between indigenous movements and Black Lives Matters movements. How resilient are those connections? That was the end of the question.
I kind of remembered part of the last thing I forgot, which maybe links up a little bit.
Yeah, how resilient are those connections, international connections?
I mean, I think it's an exciting time right now because it's like also this conversation around decolonization, I feel like for the first time, maybe ever, is not centered around whiteness, potentially. Or there's like an opportunity to have that other deeper, more complicated conversation. But it's also been really frustrating because I don't really know what the appropriate forum is for it. Because a lot of times that conversation is brought up for an audience to kind of watch and listen to while the ideas are being formulated, as opposed to a place that we could go deeper into it without having this kind of spectatorship of that.
Testing. Yeah, I was thinking too of always working against erasure is a big part of everything. Because often communities are there and present, but nobody engages them or asks them um, what role they would like to play or what role can they play. So the point that was made last night about this, the easy land acknowledgement, um, which Cornell has as well for occupying the Cayuga Nation's territory. But right around Cornell itself and Ithaca, you have those communities. So you don't have the university will now and then make those statements or maybe have a department that they allow us to do that. But then if they have to really rethink renaming things, they don't really do it. And so I say this because I was on a committee. I was on the faculty senate, and there was a subcommittee on the landscape and names and architecture. And we brought up the fact that they were going to rename a major street after a donor, which is what they ended up doing. And then when we brought up, why don't you rename some of the streets to at least give back some of those names to the indigenous people, the response we got was that many of those decisions are made from the people who give a lot of money. That's how your name gets on buildings and so on. So it's a really strange link that the institutions have with their fundraising apparatus, which links naming and buildings and so on often to donors and money. So it's a question that one has to push against all the time, but just suggesting that once you're in those institutions and then you driving down McPhee Road or whatever, you don't realize there's somebody who is giving you money. So the institutions are often bought, it seems, already by those business interests. How to push back against that, I think, is a struggle. But you also have to at least articulate it. And then the other part of it that caught me when I would drive through upstate New York was that all of the, not just the land acknowledgements, but the signs that indicate welcome to Owego, was called Owagia. And it actually says a native village which was burned to the ground by General Clinton on his way to meet General Sullivan. So all across the landscape of upstate New York, you have the history or documentation of violence and dispossession and displacement. And then many houses that indicate this was a house for Underground Railroad refuge, and there's signs that also indicate that. So to me, that's what I was trying to get to that in my book on Caribbean spaces, the conjunction between living as a Caribbean amidst those two atrocities and working there in an upstate New York context, means you have a responsibility still to have some sort of solidarity with those groups as opposed to just benefiting and working there and then, go home every night like nothing happened. So it's that kind of difficulty, I think, that we live with all the time if you have any kind of consciousness that wants to address those questions.
Is this on? Yeah. I think riffing off of what Adam said about spectatorship and the centering of whiteness, this happens a lot in the United States and Canada, where there's like a lot of settler anxiety about what decolonization looks like for white settlers. I'm just not really here for that anymore, to be totally honest with you. I think that, there is a particular way that you can conduct yourself if you're talking about decolonization with different audiences, right? You had asked a question about audience, Joel, with the first question. And you need to understand your audience. And something that the Red Nation has done now for a very long time, we do public-facing events where we understand the purpose, a very specific purpose for those events or those protests or the type of information or knowledge that we're conveying. But we do deep international work We send delegations of comrades, and mostly indigenous women and youth, to lots of different places where there is just there's the relationship building, right? Where I was talking about solidarity. We've all talked about relationality in our own ways as being essential, right? To building a movement, you have to have relationships with people and build real relationships and kinship with people. And you do that through the actual struggle together, the actual building of those relationships. And sometimes those things happen in these types of forums, right? And that's very beautiful when they do. But to expect this to be a space where we're building struggle, and like, this is what happens in the academy a lot. I think a lot of people are like, this is where we struggle. And I'm like, no, it's not. Like, this is a tiny space, a tiny bit of like where we struggle and how we struggle. But like when I'm in a community, like when we go to Palestine, we've sent so many young indigenous people to Palestine. You know, the Red Nation is ride or die for Palestinian liberation. And the reason we're ride or die for Palestinian liberation is because we have developed a relationship with very powerful Palestinian freedom fighters. And we understand the history of our connection, and we carry that relationship forward with as much integrity, right, and accountability as we possibly can. And we've sent comrades to, you know, to the Chiapas, we've sent comrades to Venezuela, we've sent comrades to Bolivia, we've sent comrades to Northern Ireland, right? And so Leon Simpson, right, who's this important Anishinaabe thinker, and I think a political figure in Canada, you know, she writes about traveling, this tradition of traveling of her people and diplomacy, right? Like, we are nations. Indigenous people belong to nations. And as such, we have diplomats. We have people who represent our nations. And before social media and like the things of, you know, our contemporary times, sometimes we would travel for weeks to engage in a diplomatic endeavor with another nation. You just have to like walk. You know, you'd have to walk to go build relationships with other nations. And so for like indigenous people, and this is how, I mean, the name of our organization is the Red Nation. We're not like a federally recognized indigenous nation, but we are indigenous people who understand that we belong to nations. And we conduct ourselves as representatives of our nations when we're doing this diplomatic work and going on these delegations. Because I think it's Stephen Salaita, who's an important Palestinian thinker, who was actually kicked out of the academy for engaging in work on Palestine and having the audacity to make connections between the liberation of Palestine and the liberation of Turtle Island in the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. You know, he wrote this book called Nationalism. And in the book, his main argument is that in order to be a nation, you must be recognized as a nation by other nations. It's a relation, right? Nationhood is a relationship, just as much as it is a proclamation. And that the work of traveling, right, Leon Simpson's concept, or diplomacy, or the building of relations is an important part of reinforcing this nationhood, whether it's indigenous nationhood or another type of even nationalism, which is somewhat different than nationhood, but that we have long traditions of doing this as indigenous nations and as representatives of those nations. And so the international solidarity work, solidarity sometimes I think is this like, who said like BIPOC? You know, it's kind of like this shorthand that fills in for a lot of things that's not very specific. And I think solidarity is a good word sometimes, but I'm very interested in internationalism as something that indigenous people who belong to nations engage in, because we take ourselves very seriously as nations, even if nobody else does, right? And we've never relinquished this, this tradition of diplomacy and traveling, you know, that we participate in. And so I think we try to educate our members in the Red about these histories, and we try to conduct ourselves in this way where we're engaged in diplomacy internationally. But the internationalism, the inter/nationalism that we do is absolutely central to, I think, our identity as an organization here within the heart of US empire that thinks of ourselves as doing the work of indigenous liberation and indigenous decolonization. Because, right, you can't achieve self-determination without international solidarity. This is something that Palestine has taught me. And again, right, the proclamation that you are a nation actually depends upon other nations recognizing you as a nation. That's a relationship, and so it's inherently something that is international, right? And so this is like one of the ways that we conceive of it in the Red Nation. We don't always do everything perfectly, but this is like what we carry in our hearts as we go about the international work.
I would like to elaborate a little bit on this notion of audience. So I'm thinking of your films. I'm thinking of the poetry, Marisa, that you use in your book. And I'm wondering, like, so what is the difference when you bring up decolonization or decoloniality to an audience like Macalester College and when you are in your own communities? How do you address it differently, and do the terms have different weight?
I can also speak really loudly, so I can do that too. Audra Simpson is a very well-known Mohawk, Kahnawake Mohawk scholar. She coined this, like, I think, well-known phrase called ethnographic refusal. I'm sure some folks are familiar with it, but essentially it's like Native people when we are subjects, research subjects, or even people who participate in co-knowledge production, which is part, I think, of the decolonizing knowledge practice, particularly in the academy, when it pertains to academic research. Indigenous people have a right, but also have always refused to share certain things in certain spaces. And I'm sure that's just not just Indigenous people. And, the audience spectatorship, the specter, spectatorship is always present because Indigenous people are consumed so heavily and commodified so heavily, and because of we're romanticized, right, in American culture. And the desire to be Indigenous is so pervasive in American culture that the refusal, no, we do not give our consent to be consumed. And so in certain spaces, it's going to have, only certain people can come into those spaces. And in those spaces, the relationships that we're making and the knowledge that we're sharing that might be considered decolonial, it stays in those spaces. And it's certainly the different scales and registers, I think, of decolonization, they certainly into different spaces, and nor should they. And nor should everyone have access to all of those things. I shouldn't have access, and I don't have access to a lot of things that happen in my community and all the other communities in the world, colonized communities and peoples who are struggling for decolonization. To be in solidarity doesn't mean I'm trying to be that person. It means I'm just down for their struggle, and that's it. And then I'm ride or die for their struggle, right? It's not a question of like belonging and wanting to be adopted by those people. This happens so much with Indigenous decolonization. And so you have to respect the boundaries that people put up around decolonization. And then you need to figure out how you can take responsibility for working in solidarity. And don't ask those people to accept you in a way that makes you comfortable. Red Nation goes all around the world where we're not from those places. We don't even speak the language, we're forcing people to speak English, when they speak Arabic or they speak Spanish or one of the thousands of Indigenous languages that are still spoken around the world. And so it's important. What is it? Charlie Sepulveda, who's this Tongan from LA, he's like, it's important to know when you're a guest and you act like a guest. And I think that right there might be the best way to describe what it means to travel through different spaces and be in different spaces, and what you should or should not access when it comes to the vast universe of what constitutes decolonization. And if someone says, and you
Right. I was going to add that it's not so much language when you move from communities. Academic communities is more ideas and thinking through, but often in community is practice and how you model certain relationships. To me, more than, because people don't want to hear you talking about all those, even your parents, your family. They're like, okay, that's the academy. So technically, you have to practice it. And I stopped going to church for one reason. Although I come from a family that was very church going, because I was in a church service one day where the minister, black man, was talking about the Palestinians as they're always going to lose and using the Bible to justify it. And after church, I told him, why did you do that? And why would you know? Because you're educating a whole community negatively. And he said, "Well, come to my office and let's talk about it." I was like, "No, I can't participate in that." So often in some of the church situations, the very religious ones, you get a kind of indoctrination that is going on that is part of sometimes a very horrendous conservative agenda. And you can see, including black churches that are sometimes very conservative. So there's a level of conservatism which runs right through black communities, running through the church and running through organizations. So one has to sometimes confront them or not participate in them at all if you don't want to always be in a battle. But to me, education also is in chatting with people in unconventional places and getting exchange of information that's sometimes more thoughtful than what you get in the academy. So it's an assumption that we are not always coming with knowledge, but that we also in that process of exchange to get a better kind of dialogue going. And it's harder to do because most academics tend to just sort of close up and do their work and not really be involved. But if you're going to be involved for black people, it's often the church or in hairdresser shops where you can listen to people talk about, whoever, Rihanna, whoever, and get some of their readings of situations, which sometimes are much more developed than you would imagine. Yeah, so it's a conscious choice to not assume you know everything and to always be learning. I'll give you one example. I was in Trinidad one day and I was going to, I had requested the birth certificate of Claudia Jones, who I worked on. And it was raining and I was going downtown to get it because they told me it was ready. And I was ready to leave and my mother looked at me and said, "Are you sure you want to go downtown today because look at the rain?" And I said to her, this is the problem with Caribbeans. A little bit of rain, a little bit of whatever, and nobody wants to go nowhere. And I'm going. So I go downtown to Port of Spain. And when I come out of the taxi, the whole of downtown is flooded. So I just turned right back and I didn't tell her anything. I just went back home. So because the water, when it floods, the water comes in and you'd have to take off your shoes and you couldn't just go anywhere. So the knowledge that sometimes people would just say in one sentence and you just assume you know better is often something that you have to check yourself with sometimes and just look at the environment or listen to the people who are coming out of that environment and listen to what they're saying and you learn sometimes even more than exchanging words and knowledge.
Now, do you want to add?
I wanted to say something about this idea of respect the boundaries because when I went to the Zapatista women encounter in Chiapas, like 4 years ago, there were women from different parts of the world that went to Chiapas, and we were like 5,000 women in that encounter. That was incredible. But many white feminists tried to ask Zapatistas women, what do you think about our fights, and what do you think about this workshop? Because there were different commissions of Zapatistas women observing the workshops and everything in the encounter, and they were very upset, like with the word, the word of the Zapatista women about their own work. And at the Zapatista women, they stay in silence during all the encounter, and in the commissions they were just observing the workshops. And a lot of people was like, please talk and say something about our struggles and what is happening in different parts of the world. And at the end of the encounter, Zapatista women said that they don't need to say anything about other struggles because in each part of the world, the struggles are different. And they would like to give that message for every or each woman because every struggle is different in different parts of the world, and they are waiting that we respect their struggles, and they don't want that we say something about their struggles because they know how to do it, and they are not waiting for for our words about the way in which they are fighting. So, okay, it was like related to your idea. Yeah.
Noah crouching down, and he was like, "Oh, friends, I need your arm to fight it to prove." Like taking the photo with one hand while his arm is being bit on the other, and they're kind of he's authoring this thing. And misinformation, or how could you something or being privy to something through that?
Work differently in your own community than to a non-indigenous community. Speaking of which, before we open the floor to the questions to the floor, um, what what do you want to say to the young people at Macalester College about the decolonial work they can participate in? What advice do you have?
Just say one.
Test, test. This one seems to be working okay. This is probably the best one. The other one's a
Woo! Oh,
Oh,
Testing. This one works?
now all three of them were. This is weird.
I know. I'm looking. I'm not seeing a lot of students, so they're not in the audience.
They're on the
So
back.
where they back? If you're a student, raise your hand. Oh, sorry, y'all are way up. Y'all are too far away. Come on, man. Come forward. The problem is the students who are doing the decolonial work are probably already in the audience and doing it back, right? So that's what I'm thinking. So we need to get to the other people and get them involved as well. So I would say make sure you bring, spread the word. The thing that I say all the time with knowledge is not like a personal kind of commodity. It's something that has to be shared. So make sure whatever you learn, you share with your roommate and talk. A lot of people say that's how they learn things, but then you end up with that person end up coming to take a class or doing something else. So make sure you share that knowledge out further if you're doing that kind of work. Because otherwise it's hard to reach people who are not here and not really interested. So it's often a small group. The other thing is don't be worried about small groups themselves, because often small groups can do a lot of work, and you'd be surprised at how much can happen just from a group of 3 people. So don't be disappointed if your group is not huge. But at the same time, try to educate your colleagues and friends around so that they know. And I think it's, all of us, I'm a perpetual learner, I keep saying. I never assume I know everything. I'm always learning. So always see yourself as a perpetual learner, learning and adding new knowledge as you go forward. To me, that's critical. Whether it's from reading, whether it's from seeing a film, or just engaging. So it has to be based on knowledge, really. And this is what I would like to underline that point that was made earlier about the importance of intellectual work. The intellectual work is so critical, otherwise we maintain the same level of knowledge repeatedly that then gets passed on. So we have to find ways to transform knowledge and have ideas that circulate, that are new and fresh and innovative and contest the old order, challenges the status quo, and so on. So knowledge is really fundamental as well.
That lifelong learner thing is legit. Yeah. And then also thinking about it in terms of also like not allowing borders or boundaries between different disciplines or content or inputs, and that it's all kind of going towards the same thing in terms of evolving one's thinking and not creating stasis in one's own thinking. I guess one thing that I've thought a lot about as part of New Red Order is trying to avoid traps. Because like in this work, there's a lot of traps and a lot of dead ends. And just trying to think like 1 or 2 steps ahead of what those obstructions to kind of keep things moving could be. Maybe that sounds too abstract, but I don't know. There's just identitarian traps, representational traps kind of laid out at every step of the way of this work. And even if you have to get into the trap, just foregrounding that you're aware that that's there can help get out of it also. And then I guess the other thing that I feel really thankful for, especially from like the teachings I have, which is almost cliche now about 7 generations, but that it allows for a political temporality that'll exist well past my lifetime. And that's something that I keep with me that keeps me sane. And like to know that this is all moving forwards, backwards, and in the present all at the same time. Yeah.
I should have said as well that students also create departments. Like Africana Studies came out from students actually asking for that department to happen and demanding it. They interviewed the director. They chose the person they wanted to lead that department and so on. So students have a lot of power. You all are not just like receptors of information. You have a lot of power to decide what your institution looks like and to ask for the kinds of courses you need that will take you into the future. I tell people you can't assume that what it is we are saying now is like where you need to be. You need to be with that and then beyond that. So it is a question of taking knowledge further, taking what you get and then seeing how it is applicable into the future. To me, that is really more important than just receiving knowledge and then, giving it back. You have to also take it and then transform it and take it further and really make sure that the institution is giving you what you need to take you further into the world.
Hello, testing. Ditto to what wasn't already said. First of all, I wasn't trying to shout at you earlier. I was just compensating for the fact that my mic kept going in and out. So just FYI, I was raising my voice. But a few things. You know, like student movements have historically been very instrumental in the larger gains that have been made in kind of progressive, radical, or revolutionary struggles anywhere in the world. And so students literally move us and ignite many of the rest of us to rise up and act, right, in solidarity. And so students have a lot of power. And like, for example, the department I came out of at the University of New Mexico, which was a Native American Studies department, like many departments, only came into existence because of the demands that students were making at a particular historical moment. And so these institutions exist for you and because of you as a student, and you have all the power, right, to shut it down, if that's what it takes, or to do what you need to do, right, to make sure that these are still sites of struggle, right, that these are spaces in which, you know, we're engaging in this larger struggle for decolonization together. So feeling very empowered. I want students to feel very empowered. Because our work and my profession revolves around you, honestly. And as an Indigenous person, understanding it might maybe the 7 generations concept, or just the intergenerational aspect of what struggle means, or like how Indigenous people, you know, we all live in like intergenerational households, for example, where it's like 4 generations in one house usually, especially out in reservation communities. Is that I understand the intergenerational nature of what decolonization and liberation looks like. And so you are a part of, you know, you're a generation that is profoundly important and indispensable, right, to the work that we are all doing as larger communities or a global community towards decolonization. But that you are also, right, decolonization, I think in my mind, is a very future-oriented project. It, you know, like what Adam was saying, it's an affirmation, it's not a negation, it's an affirmation. There's a steadfastness, I think, in kind of an Indigenous feminist approach to decolonization, where it's like, we were here, we are still here, and we will always be here, right? And that we trust that our people and that all people and all life on this planet will have a future, you know, because as the generation of now, we're struggling with our ancestors and the ancestors who are forthcoming, right? The people, the relatives that we will be ancestors ourselves to, people that we will never know, and futures that we will never see, but that the present tense belongs to the future, actually. And I've been told this before by Indigenous elders, it's kind of a scary thing, but it actually is also like, once you kind of like sit with it and acknowledge it, you're like, okay, I understand this approach to temporality, where it's like, your life doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the future. That this is a very like, this is something that elders have told me, Indigenous elders, and you're like, oh, okay. Like, that's a hard pill to swallow, but then it's also like, that makes a lot of sense, right, in terms of the temporality of decolonization. And so this commitment to the future, this steadfastness, this trust, you really truly believe in your heart that there will be a future, and that there will be a future for life on this planet. That is what Indigenous women have taught me. And so I'm just like, this is what carries me forward, even on the hardest days. And so just, I know that it's very precarious. It's very depressing, you know, what the future looks like, I think especially for younger generations. But just know that you're not alone, that you're part of an intergenerational struggle. Your ancestors are with you. You'll be ancestors to those who come after you, and that there will always be continuity. There will always be continuity, and you can trust that, and you get up every day, and you're like, I'm gonna struggle today because I know this to be true. Because for me, I would cease to be an Indigenous person if I did not believe that there was going to be a future, because it's literally written into like the fabric of who I am as an Indigenous person. And so carry that in your hearts, right? And even on your darkest days, just like, I don't know, don't let that flame go out, I guess. Because there are a lot of other people who are still holding that flame, right? And who are there alongside you and who have your back. So that's just what I wanted to say.
I think that you know your struggles, as Zapatistas women said, and you know the way that you need to take. And I am not a professor that like to say things that people need to do, because I think that it is difficult to know the struggles of others. And but I think that you have a very difficult situation for the next years, because when we talk about decolonization and decolonizing and depatriarchalizing knowledge, we are talking about eradicate coloniality and eradicate the heteropatriarchy, and that's a very difficult thing. That means that you need to think about how we can eradicate masculine, heterosexual, and sexist and capitalist domination. So I think that it is a very, very difficult struggle. And sometimes when I talk about the history of feminism, I say that we have a lot of victories, but we have also a lot of equivocations or mistakes. I don't know if we can talk about mistakes or equivocations, as tell me, Ernie. But I think that will be a very hard struggles for next generations, because I think that we need to think what we will do with those equivocations. And this word exists? See? Mistakes, yeah. And also, I think that there is something that happened in Chiapas in the 80s, when feminist anthropologists from urban cities arrived to Chiapas. They wanted to liberate indigenous women, and they said that indigenous women, they didn't know anything about liberation. And that was like a huge mistake of feminist anthropologists, as the feminist movement had the same mistakes. And I think that liberation is a very local thing that everyone needs to see in their context. But I think that creativity is very important for fighting against this colonial and patriarchal domination. And something that I would like to say, that it is important for fighting in your own struggles, is that it is important to, how do you say, ampliar los imaginarios? Yeah, it is like very important to expand your imaginaries, because maybe the old generations had a lot of limits in expand imaginations, but the imaginaries needs to be expanded. And we need to think about mistakes, and also about how to fight against those limitations. Thank you.
Test. Hello. The years have passed and your struggles have been successful. What does the world look like?
For me, what it looks like is, are you hearing me? Is that we don't have as many hierarchies as we have now. We have a more equitable world. People live and are able to share resources, and you don't have the sort of dominance of a particular sort of ethnicity that just assumes that it has all the ideas, and can decide for everybody else, which is what we've lived with for the past 500 years. So somebody had a poem, Grace Nichols from London, and she said she would like the Joint Chiefs of Staff to sit down and just take a break and rest. And she said more things that are too horrible for me to say now. But she meant that there's a time when they need to not be so visible and they need to not be actively doing anything. Just take a break and go to the beach or something. And let us build a world that is one that we can share and that is no longer so oppressive. It does not look oppressive if you on the side that is not receiving, but if you're receiving it, you know the oppressions, just the day-to-day microaggressions, the difficulties, the things people do and say. So how to remove all of that? I think that would be, it's the project for the future, for sure. So if once we do all of those things and we get the Joint Chief of Staff to stop creating missiles and bombs that they can sell to Ukraine or whatever around the world, and to stop interfering so much with every, I mean, why would you have a blockade of Cuba after this long time? I was in Havana teaching, and this young woman who used to come and clean the place where she was the person who managed the house. She would clean the rooms and so on. She posted that she couldn't find a thermometer for her. She has a 2-year-old baby who had a fever. So to get a thermometer, she was posting who in the neighborhood has a thermometer. Think about that, thermometer that you can buy at Walgreens for maybe $6, $7. The US blockade of Cuba makes it so that other countries that want to trade have a hard time trading. It's criminal. Why would that still be in place after 70 years of not working and people are managing their lives outside of that? And once you go to Havana, you realize the narrative that you get from the US does not exist there at all. People live, they share, they're trying to make their lives better. They still look good. They find alternative pathways to manage. But that level in which the US assumes that it has to control the rest of the world, we are tired of it. It's oppressive, it's tiring, it's wearing, and if there's anything that would change, that would be the other one, that the US stop thinking that it can decide how people will live their lives just because they're in this neighborhood or that they think the rest of the world should do that. And then above all, stop calling everybody who resists communist. I mean, that's one of the most offensive things. Even people like Obama is a communist. MLK was a communist. Anybody who pushes for any kind of rights suddenly becomes a communist or becomes that. And then communist then becomes equivalent for the way of really silencing people, oppressing them, naming them, controlling their ability to articulate a critical viewpoint on what's going on in the US. US does not have all the answers. There are a lot of gaps, there are a lot of mistakes, there are a lot of problems, there are a lot of hidden oppressions, visible oppressions, and so on. So to me, that is, for many of us, the biggest issue that one struggles with along. Also, stop sending that much junk food around the world. In Trinidad, no, in Trinidad, KFC, 24 hours. McDonald's. I mean, everywhere. You know, people who had really amazing fast food that they could buy and eat on the street no longer because McDonald's is there. So now you just go buy a burger. Everybody gets fat and blown up and so on. So that level of US capitalism, which enforces really horrible negative dietary practices where people had healthy ones before, this is a problem. But it's part of that same machinery of the US marketing its own capitalist interests around the world and then hurting everybody else in the process. There's so many more I can say, but I'll stop. The more I thought about it, the more I had to respond to that question. But no, the military needs to just do something else, go to the beach and relax and stop building more weaponry that they're selling around the world. And so many more.
There were like more microphones and then they disappeared. Okay, I wasn't even paying attention. Right, so what you're naming is U.S. imperialism, right? Which is, I think, the #1 enemy of the planet at our current historical moment. And so, like, it's not far-fetched for U.S. imperialism to come to an end, right? The slogan that maybe you see the U.S. out of everywhere, that's possible. That's totally possible. And what would that look like if that happened? Wow. I mean, people would actually have real self-determination. And so this future, which is not a far-fetched future, if we wanted that struggle, people would have the right, they would have some sovereignty, and they would just have the right, you know, to live free from that kind of control, that constant interference, that paternalism, the way that the US interacts with the rest of the world through military, through economy, right? All of the things that constitute, through culture, all of the things that constitute imperialism. So just riffing off of what, you know, Dr. Boyce Davies has just said, you know, if US imperialism ended tomorrow, like it would, I think people, right, there would be a transition, obviously, for how folks self-organize for self-determination, but oh, the freedom, it would be immediate in many, many places and for millions of people across the world. So when I think about the future, I just think about freedom, right? And the right to move where you need to and to live the way you need to and have relationships with people, whatever way is healthy for you. And to have relationships with the land, right? That aren't, you know, that don't have borders cut across them, where you're not arrested, you know, for like just doing basic things. So that's a very kind of, that's existential, but it's also like, it's a real thing. But yeah, honestly, if we ended US imperialism, that would like be a major, that would catapult us forward like hundreds of years in terms of decolonization. So just putting that out there.
I would like us to give a big round of applause to our speakers. I am so grateful that these 2 days have been so rich in terms of very diverse visions of disciplinary notions of decolonizations, limitations of decolonizing, the terms decoloniality, whether decolonization is or not a metaphor, and the rich visual and poetical and literary notions that work towards knowledge and power and the decolonizing of those knowledge, powers, and hierarchies, whatever they are. So I think it is time for us to close the conference, and I'm going to give the floor to Provost Lisa Anderson-Levy, who is going to bring us together one last time in her comments. And thank you for doing that.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay. I know, I feel like I have to go like this. Right. That's okay. So if anyone cannot hear me, just go like this and I'll try to be louder. So now that we have come to the end of 2 full days of rich and stimulating conversation about a timely and significant topic, decolonization, it's time for us to, wrap this up and go enjoy some togetherness. Although we may not be able to solve this huge issue today or tomorrow, the speakers have inspired us to think more deeply and to integrate these ideas into our daily practices. The International Roundtable is a signature event at Macalester College, and it brings together students, staff, faculty, and community members together to engage around significant issues of importance for our community. The topics often speak to students' activism and stimulate further engagement. The IRT is a collective effort that brings many different corners of this campus together. As you might imagine, an event of this magnitude requires a considerable amount of planning and coordination. There are many teams and individuals to thank and acknowledge. First and foremost, thank you to the 4 plenary speakers: Melanie Yazzie, Marissa Ruiz Trejo, Adam Cahill, and Carol Boyce Davies, who have all generously shared their time, scholarship, ideas, energy, and active engagement with us. Can we say thank you? I'd like to acknowledge the students who have taken leadership roles to co-chair sessions and workshops, as well as their mentors. So first, for the students, faculty mentors include Sonia Mehta, Kiri Celiata, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Yahu Najah Fian, Sonita Sarka, Julie Chadaga, Maria Fedorova, Bill Hart, Rabbi Emma Kipley Ogman, and Tia Simone Gardner. Oh my gosh, I apologize for slaughtering names. Thank you to all of you, faculty. I'd also like to both acknowledge and express my gratitude for the phenomenal work for the following members of the MAC community who supported this year's event. The artist, Gabby Estrada, class of 21, who created the beautiful artwork for this year's roundtable. The library staff who created a resource guide for the roundtable that you can find online. The ITS team, Bon Appetit. The IGC student staff, Kelsey Fox and the communications and website team, and the IGC student graphic designer for the IRT promotion, Nadia Lance, class of 26. Before we depart, it is my pleasure to invite you to the reception in the lobby of the auditorium and to remind you that the conversations will continue after the International Roundtable. So tonight, the first part of the film Reason by filmmaker Anand Patawardhan will screen at 4:45 in the Art Commons or in Art Commons 102, with the second part tomorrow at 2 o'clock, followed by Q&A with the filmmaker. So last and definitely not least, I want to extend my gratitude to Professor Joël Vitiello of the French and Francophone Studies Department. For her leadership and the advisory committee that she co-chaired this spring with Professor Olga Gonzalez from the Anthropology Department, including McAllister staff Ebony Aya, Ruth Yanish, Meg Thorson, Professor Ahu Naja Fian, and students Paul Cosme, Tamazulu, Zarin Prussia. In addition, many thanks to the Media and Cultural Studies Grants Coordinator Jeremy Meckler and Vice Provost Paul Overvoord, all for their support. Let's please give them another round of applause. Finally, I encourage all of you to start thinking about your availability to participate in the 2023 International Roundtable. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.